When we consider the Vikings today, we can draw on that same feeling of continuity. Their history is best understood as a fabric woven from many threads, rather than a single narrative. Reflecting on this helps us appreciate the diversity of experiences that make up the whole. Writing and memory were woven into Norse life through the medium of runes. Long before the arrival of parchment and ink, people carved symbols onto wood, bone, stone, and metal. The runic alphabet, known as the Futhark after its first 6 letters, existed in older and younger forms, each adapted to different linguistic needs. The act of carving runes required patience and intention, as each line and angle carried a sound and a meaning. Many runic inscriptions were short, names, ownership marks, or simple messages, such as "I am Haakon's knife" or "I miss you." Others had a ritual purpose, invoking protection or good fortune. Rune stones erected along roads or at burial sites were more elaborate. They recorded deeds, commemorated loved ones, or declared the building of bridges and churches. Some mentioned journeys to Miklagard, Constantinople, or Sirkland, Arab lands, hinting at the far-flung travels of their subjects. The Jelling stones in Denmark blend pagan imagery of serpents with Christian crosses, illustrating a moment of religious transition. In Bergen, small wooden sticks inscribed with runes have been excavated from layers of mud. These messages include love notes, jokes, prayers, and even receipts, a window into everyday communication. Runes were also used for divination. A practitioner might cast carved sticks and interpret the patterns. Though literacy was not universal, the presence of runic inscriptions across Scandinavia suggests that many people could recognize and write at least a few signs. These symbols connected personal memory to communal history. As you imagine hands pressing a knife into wood, hear the soft scrape and feel the careful attention paid to each stroke. The runes stand as whispers carved into time, bridging the spoken and the written, the immediate and the enduring. Social gatherings and feasts reinforced the bonds within Norse communities. The longhouse was not only a dwelling, but also a hall where hospitality was offered. Feasts marked important moments: harvests, weddings, successful voyages, and seasonal transitions. One of the most significant was Jol, the midwinter feast held during the darkest days of the year. Families and neighbors gathered around fires to share roasted meat, bread, and ale. Offerings were made to the gods and ancestors, asking for protection and fertility in the coming year. Songs were sung and stories recited, ensuring that cultural knowledge was passed to younger generations. The blot, a sacrificial feast, involved the ritual slaughter of animals, the offering of their blood to deities, and the communal consumption of meat. These ceremonies could take place in wooded groves or at temples. They reaffirmed the cycle of giving and receiving between humans and the divine. Hospitality was a moral imperative. To turn away a guest was shameful, and hosts were expected to provide food, shelter, and entertainment. Generous chieftains were called ring-givers, distributing precious objects to retain loyalty. Drinking horns were passed from hand to hand, creating a rhythm of sharing. Drinking, however, was accompanied by formal toasts and oaths, binding participants through words as much as through food. Games and contests followed, from wrestling to board games like Hnefatafel. In the flickering light, laughter mingled with the scent of spiced ale. As the night deepened, individuals might step outside to watch the aurora dance or to listen to the crack of ice. These gatherings were vital threads that maintained social cohesion. They balanced the demands of work with moments of joy, memory, and ritual, ensuring that the community carried its identity through the long winters and unpredictable seas. Beyond individual graves and families, the story of the Vikings includes the communities that grew up in the lands they encountered. When Norse bands settled in the British Isles, they did not remain separate raiders forever. In England, the Danelaw, named after the Danish settlers, was a region where their laws and customs prevailed. Life in the Danelaw blended Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon traditions. Farmers tilled the soil of East Anglia and the north, bringing with them plow designs and crop rotation techniques. Towns like York, known to them as Jorvik, became centers of craft and trade. Excavations at Coppergate in York have uncovered timber houses, workshops, and artifacts such as combs, weaving tools, and children's toys. The smell of smoke and the sound of hammering would have mingled with the chatter of different languages. Norse settlers married local people, exchanged stories, and learned new methods of farming and governance. Place names ending in "by" and Thorpe mark where they lived, and legal terms like wapentake reveal how they organized their assemblies. The Danelaw was not a monolithic entity, but a mosaic of communities adapting to each other. Over generations, identities blurred. Children grew up speaking both Old Norse and Old English, weaving elements of each language into something new. Their shared world was shaped by the rivers, hills, and seasons they knew in common. The slow fusion of cultures left traces in law, language, and daily life long after the era of raids had faded. Across the Irish Sea, Norse settlers established towns along the coast of Ireland and Scotland. Dublin began as a Viking longfort, a fortified ship camp. Initially used as a base for raiding, it soon evolved into a bustling port engaged in trade with Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the wider world. Archaeological layers in Dublin reveal houses built of wattle and daub, fire pits filled with charred grains, and ironworks where tools and weapons were forged. Merchants at the quayside sold furs, amber, slaves, and glass beads. Over time, Norse kings of Dublin intermarried with local dynasties and adopted Gaelic customs. The sea kings of the Isles, ruling over the Hebrides and parts of mainland Scotland, maintained fleets of longships and levied taxes on coastal farmers. Life in these maritime kingdoms was shaped by tides and storms, by the need to balance seafaring mobility with secure landholdings. Gaelic poetry and Norse sagas refer to each other, indicating a sharing of cultural motifs. Names like Somerled, who claim descent from both Norse and Gaelic ancestors, illustrate how identities intertwined. On the Isle of Man, runic crosses carved with interlacing patterns stand as testaments to the melding of Christian iconography with Scandinavian design. To walk among these stones is to feel the quiet persistence of a hybrid culture, one that arose not from conquest alone, but from gradual accommodation and shared experience. The Norse presence in the Atlantic archipelago was thus deeply embedded in the lives of fishermen, farmers, traders, and monks. Their story is one of coexistence as much as conflict. The legacy of the Vikings also includes the founding of Normandy in northern France. In 911, the Frankish king Charles the Simple made a pragmatic agreement with a Norse leader known as Rollo. In exchange for land along the Seine and a promise to defend against other raiders, Rollo accepted baptism and swore loyalty. Over the following decades, the Scandinavian settlers in this region, now called Normans, adopted the French language and embraced the feudal structures of West Francia. They built stone fortresses and developed cavalry tactics that differed from the seaborne raids of their ancestors. The Normans sent their sons to monasteries to learn Latin and law, and they married into noble Frankish families. Yet they retained a sense of independence and martial ambition. In the 11th century, Duke William of Normandy set his sights on the English throne. His conquest in 1066 was built on both Norman chivalric warfare and a seafaring tradition that allowed him to transport horses and soldiers across the Channel. The Norman conquest reshaped England's aristocracy, legal systems, and language. It also ended large-scale Scandinavian settlements in Britain by integrating the region into broader European political networks. Looking at the tapestry of early medieval history, one can see how the Viking Age did not simply end, it evolved. The people who had once raided monastic treasures now endowed churches and founded monasteries. Their descendants carried Norse resilience into new cultural forms. Further east, Norse merchants and adventurers traveled along the rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine. The Dnieper and Volga waterways served as highways linking the Baltic to the Black and Caspian Seas. The men who navigated these routes were called Rus. They established trading settlements at places like Ladoga, Novgorod, and Kyiv. These towns grew around fortified hill forts and markets. The Ruses traded furs, honey, wax, and slaves with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Arab writers like Ahmad ibn Fadlan wrote of a people who were tall, fair-haired, and heavily tattooed, who performed elaborate funerary rituals on their leaders. Over time, the Rus ruling elites intermarried with Slavic and Finno-Ugric peoples. They adopted the Old Church Slavonic language and embraced Eastern Orthodox Christianity after Prince Vladimir's baptism in 988. The primary chronicle, a medieval Slavic text, recounts how the Ruses sent envoys to study various religions before choosing Byzantine Christianity for its majestic liturgy. The conversion helped align their principalities with the cultural and political orbit of Constantinople. Norse influence persisted in the forms of law codes, ship design, and the names of rulers. Modern Russia and Belarus derived their names from this early confederation. The Norse presence in Eastern Europe demonstrates that their story was not confined to the North Atlantic. They were participants in a vast network that stretched from the Scandinavian fjords to the steppes and the Black Sea ports, navigating diverse political landscapes with adaptability. In the service of the Byzantine emperors, many Norse warriors found new opportunities. Known collectively as the Varangian Guard, these men pledged personal loyalty to the emperor and served as elite bodyguards. They traveled thousands of miles down the rivers of Eastern Europe, hauling their ships over portages and negotiating with the local tribes. When they reached Constantinople, they found a city of marble, mosaics, and bustling markets, a world unlike their homelands. The Varangians were valued for their discipline and courage. In battle, they wielded two-handed axes and formed tight ranks. Outside of combat, they were housed in barracks near the palace and received regular pay, silk garments, and jewelry. Some members left runic graffiti in the Hagia Sophia, carving their names and messages into the stone. These marks, like Halfdan was here, bring a personal voice to a distant place. After years of service, some guardsmen returned to Scandinavia with wealth and stories. Others settled in Constantinople or married local women. The existence of the Varangian Guard reveals how Norse identities were shaped by global connections. They were not merely raiders or farmers, but also mercenaries and diplomats who navigated complex imperial politics. Through their service, they encountered Greek liturgy, Roman law, and Middle Eastern trade goods, adding layers to their cultural experience. The interweaving of Norse and non-Norse cultures is also evident in trade. Arab silver coins discovered in Scandinavian hoards testify to extensive exchanges with the Abbasid Caliphate. Silk fragments found in graves suggest that textiles traveled along the same routes as furs and walrus ivory. In Damai, towns like Hedeby, merchants spoke multiple languages to haggle over prices. At the market, the scent of spices from the east mixed with the smell of smoked fish and tanned leather. Each transaction was an act of cross-cultural communication, requiring trust and negotiation. Some Norse traders undertook pilgrimages to distant markets, bringing back not only goods, but also ideas. They encountered Islamic astronomy, which influenced their navigation. They learned about Arab numerals and perhaps new methods of accounting. In turn, they shared stories of their northern landscapes and deities. These encounters did not erase distinct identities, but they softened boundaries. By night, around the hearth, travelers recounted the wonders of Samarkand or Baghdad, filling the imaginations of those who had never left home with images of deserts, minarets, and bustling bazaars. The Viking Age thus contributed to the early stages of globalization, weaving the North into a wider world of exchange. Law and governance form another vital thread in the Viking tapestry. Scandinavia did not have monarchs with absolute power during the early part of the era. Instead, assemblies called things served as the primary legal and political institutions. At the Gulating and Frostating in Norway and the Althing in Iceland, free men gathered to settle disputes, pass judgments, and establish laws. The meetings were held outdoors in open fields or on naturally elevated places. Participants camped with their families, turning legal deliberations into social occasions. A law speaker recited existing statutes from memory, while chieftains and farmers debated changes. Women could attend and sometimes sought judgments on matters affecting them. Legal codes were pragmatic, focusing on compensation and restitution. Theft or injury typically resulted in fines rather than corporal punishment. Murder could trigger a feud unless compensation, known as vergild, was paid. Exile was a severe penalty. A person declared an outlaw lost legal protection and could be killed without consequence. The Althing at Thingvellir in Iceland began in 930 and is one of the world's oldest parliaments. It reflects a commitment to collective decision-making among settlers who wish to avoid monarchic control. Over time, these assemblies codified laws that balanced individual rights with communal harmony. The emphasis on consensus and deliberation resonates with modern democratic ideals. In the quiet, open landscapes where these things convened, the echoes of voices discussing justice still seem to linger. Within Norse society, the roles of women were multifaceted. While many narratives focus on male warriors, women played crucial roles in maintaining households, managing farms, and preserving cultural knowledge. A free woman of status oversaw the storage of grain, the allocation of food, and the production of textiles. Keys to cupboards and chests hung from her belt, symbolizing her authority. Women were also traders, traveling with goods to markets and engaging in negotiations. Some participated in exploration, as evidence suggests that women were present on voyages to Iceland and Greenland. On the social level, women served as mediators in disputes, using kinship ties to foster peace. The institution of the Auder, or matriarch, allowed wealthy women to control property and influence political decisions. Archaeological finds include graves of women with swords and shields, though whether these women fought or were honored with symbolic status is debated. The sagas mention shield maidens, figures like Lagertha or Brynhild, who wielded weapons and commanded respect. More historically grounded are the Volur, seeresses, who performed rituals and divination. They wore cloaks lined with feathers, carried staffs, and chanted incantations to communicate with spirits. People sought their guidance on matters ranging from harvests to warfare. The presence of powerful women within the narratives and material culture underlines the complexity of gender roles. At night, one can imagine a woman spinning flax while reciting genealogies or songs, her voice weaving memory into fiber. Her contributions, though often silent in historical records, were the thread that held families and stories together. The institution of slavery, or thraldom, was an integral yet grim part of Norse society. Enslaved people were obtained through raids or trade, and they performed the hardest labor on farms, in mines, and in households. Thralls could be bought, sold, or given as gifts. Their children inherited their status unless freed. While some thralls could earn or be granted manumission, many lived and died in servitude. Archaeological evidence includes simple graves with few or no goods, indicating lower status. Legal codes address the treatment of thralls, sometimes specifying fines for killing someone else's thrall, but not for one's own. Despite their oppression, thralls contributed significantly to the economic output of Norse communities. Their existence reminds us that prosperity often rested on coercive systems. By acknowledging their stories, we deepen our understanding of the Viking Age as more than romantic adventure. The contrast between the freedom celebrated in sagas and the bondage of thralls invites reflection on human dignity and its historical variability. In the quiet reflection of night, the voices of those who labored unseen deserve to be remembered alongside those of kings and explorers. As climates shifted, so did Norse fortunes. The early centuries of Viking expansion coincided with a warm period that allowed for longer growing seasons and more reliable harvests. Crops like barley thrived, supporting population growth. This abundance enabled some families to invest in ships and long voyages. Conversely, in the late 10th and 11th centuries, climatic changes brought colder, wetter conditions. In Greenland, settlements founded by Eric the Red around 986 depended on pasture for livestock and trade with Europe. As temperatures dropped and sea ice increased, hay yields declined. Combined with conflicts with Inuit populations and a decline in ivory prices, these factors contributed to the abandonment of the Greenland colonies. Farmers returned to Iceland or Norway, bringing with them stories of a land of ice and storms. The environmental dimension of the Viking story reminds us that human ambitions are tied to the rhythms of nature. They adapted to changes by shifting settlements and altering economic strategies. In our own times, as we face climate challenges, these experiences resonate. The sound of wind across the open North Atlantic carries echoes of their resilience and ingenuity in the face of environmental uncertainty. Medicine and health were areas of practical knowledge passed through generations. Without formal schools, healing skills were learned through observation and experience. Healers used herbs like yarrow for wounds, juniper for colds, and angelica for digestive issues. They made poultices from honey and moss to prevent infection. Bone setters knew how to splint fractures using wooden slats and linen. For fever and illness, songs and charms accompanied treatments, invoking deities or spirits. The line between medicine and magic was thin. Archaeological remains of surgical tools, such as scalpel blades and trephination instruments, suggest that some practitioners could perform complex procedures. Burial sites sometimes include amulets believed to protect against disease. Life expectancy was limited, with high infant mortality and the constant risk of injury in daily work. Yet communities supported the sick through shared labor and food, recognizing that survival depended on cooperation. As one listens to the soft breathing of those around a fire, it is easy to imagine a healer murmuring a charm while applying a salve, blending care and belief in a single gesture. Artistic expression flourished through wood carving, metalwork, and weaving. Longhouses and ship prows were adorned with intricate interlacing patterns, often featuring animals whose bodies twist and flow into knots. These motifs, known from the Oseberg and Gokstad ships, show a deep appreciation for movement and symmetry. In metal, artists crafted brooches, pins, and arm rings using techniques like filigree and repoussé. Silver hoards reveal the weight and quality of these pieces, some imported and some locally made. Textiles were not only functional, but also decorative. Fine wool and linen were dyed with colors derived from plants like woad and madder. Patterns woven into fabrics conveyed status and regional identity. Music and poetry complemented visual arts. Skalds composed verses filled with kennings, metaphorical phrases, and performed them in halls where the firelight flickered on attentive faces. Their words commemorated deeds and entertained listeners. Music included the lyre, panpipes, and rhythm sticks. Together, these arts created an aesthetic world that was both practical and expressive. In the quiet of night, one can picture shadows moving over carved beams and hear the faint strain of a lyre accompanying a skald's soft voice. Looking further ahead, the Norse impact on the world continued long after the Viking Age. The languages they spoke left words in modern English, such as sky, egg, window, and law, reflecting legal and domestic concepts. Place names across Northern Europe preserve Norse heritage. Institutions like the jury system have roots in Norse and Anglo-Saxon practices of collective judgment. Colonial ventures of later centuries, whether by French Normans or Icelandic fishermen, carried a legacy of seafaring that can be traced to their Viking ancestors. Even the concept of constitutional checks on monarchic power owes something to the tradition of the thing and the recognition that free people have a voice. Today, people around the world engage with Norse myths through literature, film, and video games. While these modern representations sometimes exaggerate or simplify, they also demonstrate the enduring fascination with a culture that balanced maritime daring with domestic stability. Museums, reenactments, and scholarly research offer more nuanced understandings. Learning about the entire story of the Vikings encourages us to see them not as caricatures, but as human beings with hopes, fears, and complexities like our own. The entire story of the Vikings, to relax sleep. 2. The entire story of the Vikings gently unfolds in this slow, reflective telling of the men and women who lived along the northern seas. From the first gentle winds that carried their boats to far shores to the quiet farms where most spent their days, this narrative guides you through centuries of Scandinavian history with calm respect. You begin in the long twilight of the north, where summer nights hardly darken and winter days are short. Picture yourself standing near a fjord, the water smooth as glass under a pale sky. The grassy slopes are dotted with wooden huts and small plots of barley and oats. Sheep and cattle graze nearby, and smoke curls from the holes in the roofs of longhouses. It is quiet, the only sound the soft creaking of wooden beams and the distant hiss of the sea. This is the world before the great voyages, when most people in these lands lived as farmers and herders, tending to fields and animals and following the rhythms of the seasons. The word Viking conjures images of horned helmets and dragon-prowed ships, yet the term itself was used only to describe those who went on expeditions or raids. Most people of the time would not have called themselves Vikings. They were Norse, or simply farmers, craftsmen, and traders living in small communities along the coast and inland valleys. In these settlements, daily life centered on working the land, repairing boats, weaving cloth, and caring for animals. Men and women labored together, and though warfare and exploration are what legends remember, the day-to-day existence of these communities was humble and grounded. Imagine the interior of a longhouse in winter. Thick wooden walls, insulated with mud and turf, hold in the heat of a central fire. Along the sides, benches covered with animal skins provide seating and sleeping space. At one end, a loom stands ready for weaving wool into cloth. Smoke rises through a hole in the roof, carrying the scents of stew and burning wood. Children play quietly with carved wooden toys or small gaming pieces, their voices hushed. Outside, the land is covered in snow. Inside, the community shares stories and songs, telling of gods and heroes, but also of everyday tasks. Storytelling was a cherished art, and the sagas that were later written down were first spoken in settings like this. As spring returns and the ice melts from the fjords, farmers sow barley, oats, and rye. Boats are repaired after their winter rest. Fishermen head out into the cold, clear waters to cast nets and lines. Women gather plants for dyeing wool, turning it into yarn for clothing and sails. Sheep are shorn, and cows begin to give fresh milk, which is made into butter and soft cheese. Meals consist of stews simmered over the fire, bread baked from grain, and fish roasted or dried for storage. Honey sweetens mead, a weak beer is brewed, and in summer berries and nuts are collected and eaten fresh. The rhythm is steady, tied to daylight and weather. Life can be harsh, but it is also rich with community, ritual, and connection to the land. Within these communities, many trades exist. Some men and women become skilled woodworkers, shaping planks for boats and homes. Others are blacksmiths, forging tools, weapons, and nails. There are leather workers making shoes and harnesses, and potters creating simple vessels for storage. Merchants travel between settlements, exchanging goods like amber, furs, and soapstone. A few individuals might spend seasons at sea, sailing to markets across the Baltic or down rivers into the Frankish realms. Yet even those who travel begin and end their journeys in the same quiet villages, surrounded by familiar hills and fjords. The majority remain rooted in their home valleys, repeating the cycle of planting and harvest for generations. Clothing in this world is functional and warm. Wool is spun into yarn and woven into tunics and dresses. Animal skins provide cloaks and boots. Men wear trousers and long shirts, sometimes belted at the waist, while women favor apron dresses fastened by oval brooches at the shoulders. Jewelry is surprisingly common, made of bronze, silver, or bone, and worn as rings, necklaces, and brooches. These adornments are not only decorative but also serve practical functions. Brooches fasten garments, arm rings can be used as currency, and keys worn by women symbolize their role in managing the household. Homes are often longhouses built from timber frames covered in wattle and daub or turf. In coastal areas where wood is scarce, stone or sod may be used. Roofs slope steeply to shed snow and rain. Windows are small or absent, making the interior dark except for the glow of the central fire. Family members and animals sometimes share space under one roof. Livestock might be kept in a connected area during the winter for warmth. These dwellings are simple, functional, and insulated against the chill of northern winters. The landscape shapes the lives of its inhabitants. Fjords cut deeply into the coast, providing sheltered harbors and access to the open sea. Thick forests cover hillsides, offering timber for construction and fuel. In summer, wildflowers bloom along meadow edges. In winter, the world is white and still. The people here are attuned to the changing light, the migration of birds, the movements of fish, and the paths of whales. They rely on their environment, but also shape it, clearing fields, building terraces, and constructing boats sturdy enough to withstand waves and storms. Religion permeates every aspect of life. The Norse pantheon includes Odin, the wise wanderer, Thor, the thunderer, Freya, the goddess of love and fertility, and many other gods and spirits. Rituals honor ancestors and seek the favor of deities for good harvests and safe voyages. Sacred sites are marked by stones or trees. Stories of creation and the end of the world, the cycle of life and death, are told around the fire. Yet these beliefs evolve over time. Contacts with Christian lands bring new ideas, and by the end of the Viking Age, many Scandinavians adopt Christianity, building churches alongside their older sacred groves. Before voyages to foreign shores begin, there are already trade networks spanning the Baltic and North Seas. Amber from the Baltic travels south, while silks and spices come north through trading partners. Iron and silver are exchanged, and slaves captured in warfare are sold in markets. Seaborne travel is essential, and people learn from an early age how to handle boats, navigate coastlines, and read the stars. Boats are built with overlapping planks, flexible and resilient, and their designs will evolve over centuries into the sleek longships that dominate later tales. Why, then, do some men and women decide to leave home and sail into unknown waters? There is no single answer. Population growth may strain limited resources. Political conflicts and shifting power structures may push individuals to seek fortunes elsewhere. Trade opportunities beckon with rumors of rich monasteries across the sea. Climate fluctuations might shorten growing seasons. The lure of adventure and the desire to gain status or wealth play a part. In sagas, heroes set out to prove themselves. In reality, leaving home may be both a necessity and a choice. The event often cited as the beginning of the Viking Age is the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793. Monks in this Northumbrian island monastery recorded that dragon-headed ships appeared on the horizon, and men armed with swords and axes stormed the shore. They plundered treasures and took captives before disappearing back to sea. Such raids were shocking to Christian chroniclers, who saw them as punishments from God. For the Norse, monasteries represented easy targets, wealthy, poorly defended, and laden with gold and silver. The success of early raids encouraged more expeditions, and soon the coasts of England, Ireland, Scotland, and Frisia were regular destinations for raiders. Raiding was only one aspect of these journeys. Trading and exploration were equally important. The same ships that carried warriors could also carry furs, walrus ivory, amber, and slaves to markets in continental Europe and beyond. A ship returning home might bring back glass, silk, spices, or even knowledge of new lands. The early raiders discovered that plunder was unpredictable, but trade offered more stable returns. Over time, trading settlements emerged at key locations along rivers and coasts, where Norse merchants interacted with local peoples and other traders from far away. From the late 8th century into the 9th, Norse fleets grew larger and more organized. They navigated up rivers and attacked inland targets. In 845, for instance, a fleet sailed up the River Seine and besieged Paris. The Frankish king paid a ransom to make them leave, demonstrating how raids could yield wealth without prolonged conflict. Others traveled to Iberia, attacking Muslim and Christian territories alike. Along the Atlantic coast, they visited the Bay of Biscay and even entered the Mediterranean, raiding islands and coastal towns. Within a generation, these expeditions expanded into sustained campaigns. In 865, what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls the Great Heathen Army arrived in England. Led by several warlords, this force was larger than earlier raiding parties and aimed at conquest rather than hit and run plunder. Over the next 15 years, the army fought battles against the kingdoms of East Anglia, Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex. Kings were overthrown, towns captured, and large areas of eastern England came under Scandinavian control, forming what historians later call the Danelaw. As archaeological evidence now shows, this army was not solely composed of warriors. It included communities with women, children, craft workers, and merchants. Camps along the rivers served as production and trading centers where metalwork was created and bullion exchanged. The people who traveled with the army were not just raiders, they were settlers seeking new lives. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of sites linked to this army across England. At Torksey in Lincolnshire and Aldwark in North Yorkshire, evidence of workshops, gaming pieces, weights, and Islamic coins reveals the cosmopolitan nature of the Viking presence. Gaming pieces thought to have been manufactured at Torksey have been found at sites over 100 miles away. These artifacts show how far-reaching trade and cultural exchange were. Ingots, Islamic dirhams, and other objects suggest connections to Ireland, the Islamic world, and the Baltic. At another site, a cross-shaped mount found miles apart was once a single object, indicating that treasures were divided and shared among participants. These discoveries have led scholars to view the Great Army as a mobile community engaged in a variety of activities, from warfare to crafting and trade. Life in the Danelaw blended Norse and Anglo-Saxon cultures. Norse leaders adopted Anglo-Saxon styles of kingship, minting coins and issuing laws. They converted to Christianity, sometimes for political reasons, and married local women. Place names across northern and eastern England preserve the legacy of these settlers. Names ending in by, farm, thorp, village, or thwaite, clearing, are reminders of the Norse influence. The language of the area incorporated Norse words, many of which persist in modern English. Over time, Norse settlers integrated into Anglo-Saxon society, and their descendants contributed to the shaping of medieval England. Across the Irish Sea, Norse groups established settlements and trading towns in Ireland. Dublin, founded as a fortified long fort, ship harbor, in the mid-9th century, became a thriving hub for trade and cultural exchange. It grew into one of Ireland's principal towns with a mixed population of Norse and Irish. Norse settlers also founded Waterford, Wexford, and Limerick. In Scotland, They occupied the northern and western isles, including Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides, as well as parts of Caithness and Sutherland. The Norse presence in these regions lasted for centuries, leaving linguistic and genetic traces. Gaelic and Norse cultures intertwined, and sagas recount tales of chieftains navigating alliances and conflicts across the islands. Westward expansion did not stop with the British Isles. The Norse navigated the open North Atlantic, reaching the Faroe Islands and then Iceland in the late 9th century. Iceland offered uninhabited land, rich in resources, seabirds, fish, geothermal springs, and grassy pastures. Settlers established farms and eventually created a society governed by the Althing, one of the world's oldest parliamentary assemblies. Icelandic sagas, written down centuries later, preserve stories of these settlers and their descendants. Archaeological excavations at sites like the 10th and 11th century fjords in Seyðisfjörður have revealed longhouses, outbuildings, and evidence of textile production, including numerous spindle whorls and gaming pieces. The presence of a Viking toy at this site shows the more playful side of daily life, reminding us that even in remote settlements, children played and families pursued crafts and games. From Iceland, sailors ventured further west. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for killings, sailed to Greenland around 985 and established the eastern and western settlements on its southern coasts. These communities survived for several centuries, raising livestock and trading walrus ivory, but struggling with harsh conditions and isolation. Their decline, influenced by climate cooling, soil depletion, and shifting trade routes, remains a subject of scholarly debate. Some settlers may have returned to Iceland or Norway. Others may have moved to North America. Around the year 1000, a small group from Greenland, led by Leif Erikson, sailed west and reached a land they called Vinland. Archaeological remains at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland confirm a Norse presence in North America. The site contains the remains of sod-walled structures, iron nails, and objects consistent with Norse technology. Although the settlement appears to have been short-lived, it demonstrates the extraordinary range of Norse exploration. The reasons for the abandonment of Vinland are not entirely clear. Encounters with indigenous peoples, whom the sagas call Skrællingar, may have led to conflict. Distance from home and limited resources likely played roles as well. The voyages to Vinland remain an evocative chapter in Norse history, representing both bold exploration and the limits of expansion. While some Norse traveled west, others traveled east along the rivers of Eastern Europe. Merchants known as the Russ journeyed from the Baltic Sea down the Dnieper and Volga rivers to the Black and Caspian Seas. They traded furs, slaves, and other goods, establishing trading posts and settlements along the way. Modern scholarship recognizes these Russes as culturally Scandinavian but ethnically mixed, incorporating Slavic and Finno-Ugric peoples. Arab writers of the 9th and 10th centuries recorded encounters with them. One traveler, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, described the Rus as tall and blond, heavily tattooed, and armed with swords and axes. He noted their distinctive funerary practices, which included human sacrifice. Another source, the 9th century Abbasid official Ibn Khurradadbi, recorded that the Russes traded pelts and swords along routes reaching as far as Baghdad and China. These accounts illustrate how far-reaching Norse trade networks were and how they connected northern Europe to the Islamic world and beyond. In the Piedmont East, Norsemen served as mercenaries and bodyguards. The Varangian Guard, an elite unit of the Byzantine Emperor's personal army, included Scandinavians who swore allegiance to Constantinople. Famous among them was the future Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, who served in the Guard in the 1030s and 1040s, gaining wealth and experience before returning to Norway. Hardrada's career epitomizes the fluid identities of Norse individuals. He was at once a mercenary, a trader, a king, and a raider. His later attempt to claim the English throne in 1066 ended at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, often considered one of the events marking the end of the Viking Age. Ships were central to all these endeavors. Early ships were broader and deeper than the sleek warships of later sagas. They were capable of carrying cargo and livestock across the North Sea. Over time, shipbuilders developed longer, narrower vessels with higher prows and sterns. The clinker-built technique, in which overlapping planks are fastened with iron rivets, or, in earlier versions, sewn together, produced sturdy hulls that flexed with the waves. Sails made of wool allowed vessels to harness the wind, while rows of oars provided propulsion when winds were light or contrary. Crews navigated by observing the sun, stars, and landmarks. They also used a sunstone, a crystal that polarizes light, to determine the sun's position on cloudy days, though the evidence for this is debated. Knowledge of currents, winds, and seabirds helped mariners cross open waters. The success of Norse exploration and trade rested upon these maritime skills. Archaeological discoveries continue to illuminate ship design and burial practices. In 2025, archaeologists from the Arctic University Museum of Norway excavated a rare boat burial on Senja Island. The grave contained the remains of a woman and her dog, dated to around 900-950 CE. The boat, about 5.4 meters long, had decomposed, but its sewn construction was evident from the impression left in the soil. The woman was buried on her side with bent knees, arms crossed, and with grave goods, including brooches, beads, an iron sickle, and textile tools. The presence of a dog suggests a cherished companion rather than a sacrifice. This burial, with its combination of practical and high-status items, offers a glimpse into the social roles of women and their importance in Norse households. Archaeologists noted that dogs in graves are rare and that further analysis will reveal more about her origin and diet. Another unusual burial came to light in 2025 at Val in Bjugn, central Norway. A hobbyist with a metal detector found an oval brooch, prompting archaeologists to uncover a well-preserved grave of a woman dressed in classic Norse style. She wore 2 oval brooches at her chest and a ring brooch from her underdress. What set this burial apart was that 2 scallop shells were placed over her mouth, an undocumented ritual in Norwegian graves. Small bird bones, primarily, wing bones were carefully arranged along the grave. The meaning of this ritual remains a mystery, but archaeologists speculate it might signify protection or another symbolic practice unique to the community. DNA and osteological analyses may reveal more about her age, health, and relationship to other burials nearby. The discovery underscores the diversity of burial customs and the care taken in honoring the dead. In Denmark, a significant burial site discovered near Lisbjerg in 2025 contained around 30 graves dating from the second half of the 10th century during the reign of King Harald Bluetooth. The graves were associated with a noble family and contained pearls, coins, ceramics, and a box filled with gold thread. Archaeologists believe the site was linked to a farm less than a kilometer away. Some graves contained human remains, and one grave, possibly belonging to an important woman, held a box of decorative objects and a pair of scissors. These finds highlight the wealth and connections of high-ranking families. The presence of foreign goods suggests wide trading networks and a desire to take treasured possessions into the afterlife. Other graves from 2024 and 2025 reveal insights into social status and gender roles. At Skomsnes Farm in western Norway, archaeologists uncovered a burial ground with at least 20 graves. 3 graves belonged to women buried in the early 800s. One was a boat grave. The woman was laid to rest with brooches, a necklace of 46 glass beads, and 11 silver coins, including a rare Hedeby coin. Such grave goods suggest wealth and extensive contact networks, showing that women could hold significant status and that valuable objects were not limited to large burial mounds. Another find at the same site included jewelry and objects related to textile production, reinforcing the importance of weaving and cloth in Norse society. These discoveries expand our understanding of women's roles and indicate that social and economic connections extended across Scandinavia and beyond. Not all discoveries relate to wealth. At the Myklebust burial mound in western Norway, excavation in 2024 unearthed a Viking ship thought to belong to a chieftain. Much of the ship remains unexcavated, preserved for future generations, but the recovered rivets will help determine its size and function. The excavation also revealed a 150-year-old message in a bottle left by a 19th century archaeologist, reminding modern researchers of the long history of archaeological inquiry. Such finds connect present-day investigations with those of the past, illustrating how each generation contributes to understanding Viking heritage. Violence is part of the Norse story, but recent studies show that it varied by region and context. Research examining Viking skeletons from Norway and Denmark reveals differing patterns of injury and death. In Norway, a significant proportion of remains show evidence of blunt force and sharp weapon injuries. Some skulls bear marks of crushing blows or slashing cuts. Arrowheads are embedded in bones. These injuries suggest battles or violent encounters. In Denmark, many skeletal remains show evidence of beheading, indicating executions rather than battlefield deaths. Scholars interpret this as a sign of centralized authority capable of carrying out judicial killings. The variation in violence underscores differences in social and political structures across Scandinavian societies and challenges monolithic images of the Vikings as uniformly warlike. Another insight into Norse customs comes from research into cremation sites. At Heath Wood in Derbyshire, the only known large-scale Viking cremation site in the British Isles, archaeologists found human and animal remains associated with the Great Heathen Army. Strontium isotope analysis showed that some of the animals, including horses and dogs, originated from the Baltic Shield, encompassing parts of Norway, Sweden, and Finland. This provides scientific proof that Vikings brought their animals with them. Horses and dogs were status symbols and were cremated with their owners, perhaps to accompany them to the afterlife. The research also suggests that early ships were broad and deep, capable of carrying livestock across the sea. These findings support the view that the Great Army was a mobile community with families and animals, not just a band of warriors. They also highlight the complexity of Norse funerary rituals, blending practical considerations with spiritual beliefs. Everyday life included more than work and violence. People enjoyed games, sports, and music. Hnafatafl, a board game of strategy, was played across Scandinavia. Gaming pieces discovered at Torksey and Lindisfarne attest to its popularity. Physical competitions like wrestling and racing were common, providing opportunities for skill and entertainment. Music and poetry filled long winter evenings. Skalds, or poets, composed verses praising heroes and recounting genealogies. Storytelling preserved history and myth, ensuring that oral traditions survived until they were written down in sagas centuries later. These cultural practices fostered community and continuity. Women played a central role in these communities. They managed households, oversaw food production and textile work, and held keys symbolizing control over domestic resources. While most evidence suggests that women rarely fought, sagas and some archaeological finds indicate that female warriors may have existed. The high-status graves of women with weapons, such as one discovered in the late 19th century at Birka in Sweden, have been re-examined with modern methods, revealing that the buried individual was indeed female. This challenges assumptions about gender roles and suggests that women's participation in warfare or leadership may have been more complex than previously thought. Whether fighting or not, women were integral to social, economic, and spiritual life. Religion evolved over time. Early in the Viking Age, the Old Norse pantheon and rituals dominated. Sacred groves, stones, and springs served as sites of worship. Offerings of food, drink, and valuables were made to gods and spirits. Blot, sacrificial feasts, honored deities, and ancestors. As Norse traveled and settled abroad, they encountered Christianity. Missionaries from the Frankish realms and Anglo-Saxon England sought to convert them, sometimes offering baptism in exchange for trade agreements or political alliances. Conversion often occurred first among leaders who saw advantages in aligning with Christian powers. King Harald Bluetooth famously erected a rune stone proclaiming that he had united Denmark and made the Danes Christian. Churches began to replace pagan sites, and by the 11th century, Christianity was widespread in Scandinavia. Yet old beliefs persisted. Sagas written in Christian times still tell of Odin and Thor. The blending of old and new shaped the region's cultural landscape. As centuries passed, Norse settlements developed into new political entities. In Normandy, Norsemen led by Rollo were granted land by the Frankish king in exchange for protecting the Seine Valley. They adopted the French language and customs, intermarried with local nobility, and their descendants would later conquer England in 1066. In Ireland, Norse towns became centers of trade and culture, contributing to the emergence of urban life. In Scotland's Northern Isles, Norse earls ruled for generations before acknowledging Scottish kings. In Eastern Europe, the Russes founded principalities that evolved into modern Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. These transformations illustrate how Norse migrants adapted to local conditions and influenced the societies they joined. The end of the Viking Age cannot be pinned to a single event, but is marked by shifts in politics, warfare, and trade. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, where the English king Harold Godwinson defeated Harold Hardrada, is often cited as a turning point. Shortly thereafter, the Norman conquest of England brought another group of Norse descendants to power. In Scandinavia itself, kings consolidated control, curbing the independence of local chieftains and outlawing private raiding. The spread of Christianity and feudal structures changed the social fabric. Trade routes shifted as new powers rose and others declined. By the mid-11th century, the era of Viking expansion was largely over, though Norse cultural influences persisted. Even after the raids and voyages ceased, the Norse world continued to produce art, literature, and craftsmanship. Runes evolved into Latin script. Manuscripts like the Poetic Edda and Prose Edda preserved mythological and heroic material. Wood carvings, metalwork, and stone crosses exhibit distinctive styles. Place names across the North Atlantic and the coasts of Europe attest to Norse settlement. Genetic studies show the legacy of Norse ancestry in regions such as the i.e. British Isles, Iceland, Normandy, and the Faroes. The fascination with the Viking Age endured, inspiring medieval chroniclers, romantic nationalists, and modern storytellers. Each generation reshaped the image of the Vikings to suit its own needs and imagination. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to refine our understanding. The unearthed silver treasure at Ordal in southern Norway, found under the floor of what was once a thrall's house, comprised 4 large arm rings with intricate decoration. Hidden about 20 centimeters below ground, the rings were discovered exactly where they were placed over 1,000 years ago. Their position suggests that they were deliberately buried, perhaps in haste before their owner fled or was killed. Such treasures reveal the complexity of social hierarchies and the wealth accumulated by some individuals. The same excavation unearthed a large Viking farm, indicating that significant economic activity occurred in the area. This find demonstrates that farmsteads could be centers of power and wealth, challenging narratives that focus solely on chieftains and kings. Another remarkable find from the Skumsnes farm in Fitjar includes 3 wealthy women's graves from the first half of the 800s. The well-preserved jewelry, rare coins, and textile tools found there emphasize the high status of these women and their connections to networks stretching from Denmark and England to the Carolingian Empire. One grave, a boat burial, contained brooches and a necklace made of glass beads and silver coins. Such graves illustrate that wealth and influence were not confined to men, and that women played crucial roles in maintaining and displaying family status. The presence of coins minted far away shows the reach of trade and the value placed on foreign currency. The 2024 excavation of the children's burial site at Østfold in southeastern Norway revealed 41 graves, most containing cremated remains of newborns and children up to 6 years old. This unique burial ground raises questions about community practices and beliefs regarding child death. Children rarely had separate burial sites, so dedicating a cemetery to them suggests care and ritual. The graves date from between 800 and 200 BCE, predating the Viking Age, but shedding light on earlier practices that influenced later customs. Archaeologists debate whether the site was associated with ritual or represented a response to high infant mortality. The discovery underscores the emotional dimensions of archaeology and the human stories behind artifacts and bones. The story of a skeleton recovered from a well at Sverresborg in Trondheim further connects legend and evidence. According to Sverre's saga, a man was thrown into the well in 1197 during a conflict between rival factions. The skeleton, retrieved in 2016 and analyzed in 2024, confirmed the tale's plausibility. Such instances where archaeology intersects with medieval literature enrich our understanding of how historical narratives were constructed and how they relate to actual events. They also demonstrate the value of interdisciplinary approaches, combining textual and material evidence. Beyond Scandinavia, the discovery of the Galloway hoard, exhibited in 2025, showcases the treasures amassed by Norse and Gaelic peoples in Scotland during the 9th century. This hoard includes silver, gold, silk, and even rare Byzantine artifacts. It reveals connections across Europe and the Middle East and illustrates how wealth was stored and hidden during times of turmoil. Each piece in the hoard tells a story of craftsmanship and trade. Similarly, ongoing excavations at Viking Age sites in Iceland, such as the so-called Icelandic Pompeii in Seyðisfjörður, promise to reveal new insights into daily life, production, and social organization. The revisionist transformation of Viking studies reminds us to avoid simplistic generalizations. Scholars now emphasize diversity within Norse communities. Some individuals engaged in piracy, others in farming, trading, or serving as mercenaries. Identities were fluid. One could be a farmer, a trader, a raider, and a poet at different times. The term Viking itself referred to an activity going on an expedition, not to an ethnicity or nation. Most people of the era would not have identified themselves as Vikings, but by their family, locality, or profession. This nuance matters when considering the many stories from the period, for it expands our view beyond stereotypes and acknowledges the complexity of human experience. In the modern imagination, Vikings often appear as horned warriors. However, archaeological evidence indicates that helmets were likely simple iron caps or leather hats. Horns would have been impractical in battle. The image of horned helmets derives from romantic art and opera costumes of the 19th century. Similarly, the idea of Vikings as purely violent marauders ignores the agricultural, craft, and domestic aspects of their lives. Reenactments and museums today strive to present a more accurate picture, emphasizing daily life, trade, and cultural exchange. Festivals in York, Dublin, and other former Viking towns celebrate this heritage with reconstructed ships, crafts, demonstrations, and storytelling. Before we arrive at the gentle closing of this narrative, it is worthwhile to wander more slowly through the intricate weave of Norse life and lore. The centuries before the recorded Viking Age were times of gradual change across Scandinavia. During the Bronze Age, coastal peoples carved images of ships, warriors, and animals into rock faces, perhaps as offerings to unseen powers or records of seasonal gatherings. Communities were small, centered on family farms with burial mounds on nearby hills. Metal came from trade networks that stretched deep into Europe, and amber from the Baltic was prized far away. By the Iron Age, local chieftains held sway over clusters of farms, and longhouses grew larger to accommodate extended families and their animals. Contact with Roman merchants introduced new goods and ideas, though the northern peoples remained outside the empire. The seeds of future voyages were sown in these centuries of exchange and adaptation. Social structure in Norse society was layered yet interconnected. At the top were jarls, powerful leaders who oversaw large estates, commanded ships and warriors, and engaged in diplomacy. They held wealth in the form of land, livestock, and treasures. Below them were carls, the free farmers and craftsmen who made up the bulk of the population. Carls owned or leased land, could bear arms and participate in assemblies. They owed loyalty to their jarl and were expected to provide men for expeditions or defense. At the bottom were thralls, or slaves, who performed much of the labor in households and fields. Some thralls were born into servitude, while others were war captives or debtors. Though their lives were constrained, thralls could sometimes earn or be granted freedom. Manumission ceremonies, witnessed by the community, marked their transition to free men. This social hierarchy shaped obligations, rights, and relationships across generations. Agricultural life in Scandinavia required careful management of land and resources. Fields were cleared from forests through a combination of slash and burn and controlled grazing. Farmers plowed with wooden ards pulled by oxen or horses, turning the thin soils to plant hardy crops such as barley, oats, and rye. Rotating fields and leaving some fallow helped preserve fertility. Hay was cut in late summer and stored in raised barns to feed livestock through winter. Cattle, sheep, and goats provided milk, wool, and manure. Pigs foraged in forests. Horses were valued for transport. Seasonal rhythms dictated work. Spring brought plowing and sowing. Summer required tending crops, fishing, and repairing fences. Autumn was the time for harvests, slaughtering surplus animals and preserving food. Winter allowed for craft work and indoor tasks such as spinning wool, carving wood, and making tools. Inside longhouses, the hearth was the heart of the home. A stone or clay-lined fire pit ran along the center, providing heat, light, and a place to cook. Smoke rose through a vent or hole in the roof, filling the space with a constant haze. Benches lined the walls, covered with furs and textiles. At night, families slept on these benches, wrapped in blankets or skins. Personal belongings were stored in chests, hung on pegs, or placed in niches carved into the walls. The longhouse served multiple functions: living space, workshop, storage, and sometimes barn. At one end, a byre might house animals, their body heat contributing to warmth. High seats at the center of the hall signified status and were reserved for the household head and honored guests. Light came from the fire, oil lamps carved from stone, or rushlights dipped in tallow. Tasks around the hearth were often the domain of women, who managed food preparation and textile production. Stews simmered in iron cauldrons, with ingredients added as they became available. Bread was baked on flat stones or in clay ovens. Women also tended to drying fish, smoking meat, and fermenting vegetables. In summer, they gathered herbs and berries for medicine and flavoring. Spinning wool into yarn using a drop spindle required patience and skill. The yarn was then woven on a warp-weighted loom, where vertical threads were held taut by clay or stone weights. Weaving produced cloth for clothing, blankets, and sails. Dyeing was an art, using plants like woad for blue, madder for red, and lichens for purple. Sails in particular needed strong, tightly woven wool to withstand wind and spray, and the production of a single sail could occupy a household for months. Men and women both worked leather, shaping hides into shoes, belts, pouches, and harnesses. Tanning required soaking skins in mixtures of bark and urine to soften them and make them durable. Antler and bone were carved into combs, buttons, needles, and handles. Personal grooming was not neglected. Combs were common in graves, indicating that tidiness and appearance mattered. Metal workers turned bog iron, collected from marshes, into tools, nails, weapons, and ornaments. Smelting iron involved building a low furnace lined with clay, then adding layers of charcoal and ore. As air was blown through the furnace, the ore smelted into a spongy mass that was then hammered to remove impurities. Blacksmiths sharpened plowshares, forged knives and axes, and created intricate patterns in sword blades by alternating layers of iron and steel. The quality of ironwork was a source of pride and could elevate a craftsman's reputation. Diet was varied, reflecting both agriculture and the bounty of the sea. Breakfast might consist of porridge made from barley or oats, sweetened with honey. Later meals included stews of meat and vegetables, thickened with grains, and flavored with herbs. Fish, both fresh and dried, was a staple along coasts and rivers. Herring and cod were salted and stored in barrels or hung to dry as stockfish. Meat from pigs, cattle, sheep, and goats was preserved by smoking, drying, or fermenting. Reindeer and game were hunted in forests and mountains. Milk was consumed fresh or turned into butter, cheese, and skyr, a tangy dairy product that could be stored for months. Eggs from chickens and wild birds supplemented protein. Berries, nuts, and fruits like apples and pears were gathered and eaten fresh, dried, or made into preserves. Honey was prized not only as food, but also for brewing mead. Beer, often weak, was brewed from grain and water, while wealthier households occasionally imported wine. Fishing and hunting were vital for coastal and inland communities. Nets woven from plant fibers or animal hair were cast into rivers and fjords. Lines and hooks fashioned from bone or iron caught larger fish. In winter, holes cut through ice provided access to fish below. Whales stranded in shallow waters were quickly butchered, providing oil, meat, and bone. Seals were hunted for meat and hides. Inland, hunters pursued deer, elk, and boar. They used bows, spears, and traps, and sometimes hunted cooperatively, driving animals toward nets or enclosures. Hunting required knowledge of animal behavior, tracking, and patience. The Sami people of northern Scandinavia traded reindeer meat and hides with Norse communities, and in some regions, Norse and Sami intermarried or shared resource areas. Feasts were occasions for community and display. When harvest was gathered or a successful raid concluded, chieftains hosted gatherings in their halls. Neighbors, allies, and sometimes rivals were invited to share food, drink, and entertainment. The host's generosity affirmed his status and secured loyalty. During a feast, mead or beer flowed, and horns or cups were passed around the table. Guests made toast to gods, ancestors, and each other. Storytellers recited sagas and heroic lays, preserving history and values. Musicians played lyres or harps. Contestants engaged in flyting, a poetic exchange of insults and boasts. Wrestling tests of strength and games provided amusement. Feasts could last several days and often coincided with seasonal festivals, such as Yule in midwinter or the harvest blot. These gatherings reinforced social bonds and maintained collective identity. Entertainment extended beyond feasts. Games were popular during long winters. An Ifadafel, a strategy game played on a board of squares with two opposing armies, tested cunning and patience. Knucklebones and dice games provided simpler amusements. Physical competitions included ball games played on fields or ice, sometimes using curved sticks resembling early forms of hockey. Skiing was not only a means of transportation, but also a sport. Children practiced archery and throwing spears. Riddles and tales filled evenings, encouraging wit and memory. Runes were sometimes used for playful messages or carved as charms on small pieces of wood. Poets composed verses in complex meters such as drotkvet, full of kenning's metaphoric expressions like whale road for the sea. The mastery of language and humor was admired, and skilled skalds could earn places at chieftains' tables. Written communication took the form of runes. The younger Futhark, consisting of 16 characters, was carved into wood, bone, or stone. Rune stones erected across Scandinavia and beyond memorialized the dead, marked territory, or boasted of achievements. Inscriptions might read, X raised this stone in memory of Y, his father, a good man, followed by a prayer or a depiction of a serpent entwining the text. Some stones mention journeys to lands across the sea, to England, Byzantium, or far to the east. Others feature Christian crosses alongside traditional motifs, reflecting the transition from paganism to Christianity. Carving runes required precision, as mistakes were hard to correct. The act of raising a rune stone was communal, involving family and neighbors, and the stone served as a lasting testament to memory and identity. Literature flourished in the centuries after the Viking Age, but its roots lie in oral tradition. The sagas of Icelanders, written in the 13th and 14th centuries, recount events from earlier times. Egil's saga tells of the poet-warrior Egil Skallagrimsson, his battles, travels, and poetry, illustrating the importance of honor and the power of words. Njal's saga explores themes of friendship, law, and vengeance, set against the backdrop of the Icelandic Commonwealth. The sagas combine historical facts with legend and reveal details of daily life, such as legal procedures, farming practices, and household chores. They also convey the values of the society: loyalty, honor, fate, and the consequences of choices. Though composed long after the events they describe, these texts preserve memory and contribute to our understanding of Norse culture. At the center of Norse cosmology stands Yggdrasil, the world tree. Its branches extend to 9 realms: Asgard, home of the gods; Midgard, the world of humans; Jotunheim, realm of giants; Vanaheim, home of the Vanir deities; Alfheim, land of the light elves; Svartalfheim, world of dwarves; Muspelheim, land of fire; Niflheim, realm of ice and mist; and Hel, the abode of the dead. The gods dwell in halls within Asgard Odin in Valhalla, where slain warriors feast; Thor in Thrudheim; Freya in Folkvanger. Beneath Yggdrasil, the 3 Norns Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld spin the threads of fate. A serpent, Nidhogg, gnaws at the roots, while an eagle perches in its branches. This cosmology framed the Norse understanding of existence, linking their world to realms of myth and the supernatural. Myths explain natural phenomena and moral lessons. In one tale, Odin sacrifices an eye at Mimir's well to gain wisdom. In another, Thor, seeking to retrieve his stolen hammer, disguises himself as Freya and attends a wedding feast among the giants. Loki, the trickster, alternates between aiding and undermining the gods. The story of the necklace Brisingamen tells of Freya's desire and cunning. The legend of Sigurd and the dragon Fafnir, found in the Volsunga saga, inspired later epic literature. Myths also depict Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when giants and monsters will battle gods in a cataclysmic conflict, leading to destruction and renewal. These stories were likely told and retold around fires, shaping collective beliefs and offering frameworks for understanding life's challenges. Religious rituals in Norse society were diverse and localized. The blot was a sacrificial feast held to honor gods, spirits, and ancestors. Participants offered animals, often pigs, goats, or cattle, by slaughtering them, sprinkling their blood on altars and participants, and then cooking and eating the meat together. The blot might take place at a hof, temple, a sacred grove, or a household's high seat. Priests and priestesses, sometimes from leading families, presided over ceremonies. Seeresses, known as volur, performed Seder, a form of ecstatic prophecy and magic. Cider practitioners were revered and feared. They could bless, curse, or foresee the future. In some sagas, Seder is associated with weaving fate. The practice of burying valuable objects in bogs or lakes suggests offerings to deities or spirits, perhaps to ensure good harvests or safe voyages. The Norse believed that the landscape was inhabited by land spirits, or landvættir. Respect for these spirits influenced behavior. Before clearing land or building a house, people offered food or drink to placate the local spirits. In some regions, dragon-shaped prows on ships were removed or covered before sailing into a harbor to avoid frightening the landvættir. The house spirit, or Nisa, was thought to watch over the farmstead, aiding with chores and ensuring prosperity in exchange for respect and offerings. Such beliefs fostered a sense of connection to the environment and the unseen, shaping actions and rituals. Legal systems in Norse societies were largely customary, but formalized through assemblies. Local things met regularly to adjudicate disputes, assign fines, and decide community matters. The Icelandic Althing, founded in 930, brought chieftains and free farmers together each summer at Thingvellir. A law speaker memorized and recited a portion of the laws each year, ensuring their transmission. Cases ranged from property disputes and accusations of theft to killings and feuds. Compensation, or vergild, was paid for injuries and deaths, with amounts determined by social status and circumstances. If agreements could not be reached, a person might be declared an outlaw, losing legal protection. Outlaws could be killed without consequence, though they sometimes fled abroad. Women participated indirectly through male relatives, but could own property, initiate divorce, and reclaim dowries. The legal culture emphasized mediation and restitution over corporal punishment. Punishments varied. A thief might be fined or have property confiscated. In cases of grievous injury or murder, the offender's family paid compensation to the victim's kin. If the crime was egregious or unresolved, the guilty party could be banished, forfeiting all rights. Execution was less common but did occur, often for repeat offenders or those considered dangerous. Decapitation and hanging were methods used in some regions. Drowning was another form of capital punishment, especially for women accused of infanticide. The emphasis on restitution and social balance is evident in sagas where families negotiate settlements to end feuds. These negotiations involved complex calculations of honor, wealth, and reconciliation. The roles of women were more varied than often assumed. They managed households, controlled food and textile production, and raised children. They could inherit property, particularly land and movable goods, though inheritance rules favored male heirs. A woman's consent was required for marriage, and she could divorce a husband for reasons such as mistreatment, neglect, or failure to provide. Divorced women retained their dowries and returned to their family or remained as independent householders. Some women held religious authority as volur, mediating between the human and spirit realms. Others were involved in trade, managing markets, or traveling with goods. High-status women were sometimes buried with weapons, suggesting roles in defense or leadership. Graves like those at Skumsnes and Bjugn show that women possessed wealth and influence. The complexity of women's lives is reflected in sagas that feature strong female characters like Gudrun Osvifsdottir and Freydis Eiriksdottir. Slavery was a significant aspect of Norse economies. Thralls worked fields, tended animals, built houses, and rowed ships. They were acquired through birth, trade, or capture in raids. Slaves could be bought at markets in Dublin, Hedeby, or Birka, and sold in the east or south. Their value depended on age, skills, and health. Though thralls had few rights, they were part of households and sometimes developed close relationships with their masters. Manumission could occur through payment, reward for loyalty, or the owner's will. Freed thralls became freedmen, lacingjar, with limited rights but potential for social mobility. The presence of slaves allowed free men and women to engage in trade, exploration, and warfare, illustrating how different social layers supported each other. Shipbuilding was both art and science. Craftsmen selected oak, pine, or ash trees from forests, choosing trunks with the right curvature for keels and ribs. They felled trees in winter when sap was low, then split logs into planks using axes and wedges. Planks were shaped with adzes and axes to fit snugly together. In sewn boats like the one found at Senja, planks were stitched with cords made from animal sinew or roots. Later ships used iron rivets. Beams held the hull's shape, and a keel provided stability. A mast step supported the mast, which held a square sail woven from wool, sometimes reinforced with leather patches. Ropes twisted from hemp or animal hair controlled the sail. Steering boards attached to the starboard side guided the ship. A finished ship was smeared with tar to seal it and sometimes decorated with carvings. Launching a new vessel was accompanied by rituals seeking favor from the gods. Navigation on open seas demanded skill and observation. Mariners watched the sun's path and the stars at night to maintain direction. They noted the color of water, which changed near land, and observed seabirds' flight, as some species flew out to feed in the morning and returned to land at night. Whales, fish, and driftwood indicated proximity to coasts. Sailors used sounding leads weights attached to lines marked with knots at intervals to measure depth and sample seabed composition. A piece of tallow on the weight collected sand or mud, which could be compared to known sea bottoms near home. Some Icelandic sagas mention a sunstone, a crystal that polarized light and may have helped locate the sun on cloudy days. While the existence of this device is debated, Norse mariners certainly relied on a combination of knowledge, experience, and keen senses to navigate vast distances. Trade linked Scandinavia to a wider world. From the Baltic, amber, furs, and slaves were sent south. Soapstone vessels and iron were exchanged for silver, wine, glass, and spices. Walrus ivory, hunted in Arctic waters, was valued for carving and exported to Europe. In Dublin and York, Norse craftsmen produced jewelry using Irish silver and insular designs, blending styles. Islamic dirhams circulated widely, cut into pieces or melted down into ingots. Weights and scales were used to measure silver. Standardized ring money and arm rings functioned as currency. Traders traveled along river routes through modern Russia and Ukraine, meeting Khazar tax collectors, Bulgars, and steppe nomads. They brought back silks, brocades, spices like pepper and cinnamon, and glass beads. Objects found in Scandinavian graves, such as peacock feathers, demonstrate the reach of these networks. Eastern trade routes had dangers and opportunities. The Russes controlled trading stations along the Dnieper and Volga. At times, they allied with local tribes. At other times, they fought. Byzantine records mention treaties granting the Russes trading rights in Constantinople. Norse merchants camped outside city walls and sold furs, honey, and slaves. Some joined the Varangian Guard or served as mercenaries in other eastern courts. They adopted elements of local cultures, wearing silk garments or carrying icons while maintaining their own traditions. When returning home, they brought new ideas, technologies, and goods. These exchanges influenced art, religion, and social practices back in Scandinavia, contributing to the development of complex societies. Cultural exchange occurred with many neighbors. In the north, the Norse and Sami traded goods and shared technologies. Sami expertise in reindeer herding and skiing influenced Norse practices. In return, the Sami acquired iron tools and textiles. In the British Isles, Norse settlers interacted with Celtic populations. The Kingdom of Dublin was a Norse-Gaelic hybrid, and many Irish monasteries produced manuscripts with Norse influences. In Scotland's Northern Isles, Norse earls governed, but adopted aspects of Pictish and Gaelic culture. The Gall Gaedhil, or Norse Gaels, were people of mixed heritage who forged new identities, speaking both languages and combining artistic traditions. In Normandy, Norse settlers gradually learned the local Romance language and adopted feudal customs, yet they kept seafaring skills that later enabled the Norman conquest of England. These adaptations illustrate how Norse identities were fluid and responsive to local environments. The formation of the Russes states in Eastern Europe embodies cultural fusion. Scandinavian traders settled among Slavic communities, establishing towns like Novgorod and Kiev. Over generations, these settlements grew into principalities, adopting Slavic languages and Orthodox Christianity. The primary chronicle, written in the 12th century, recounts the invitation of the Varangian prince Rurik to rule over the Slavs, though scholars debate its accuracy. Archaeology shows that mixed communities existed along rivers where Scandinavian and Slavic grave goods appear together. By the 10th century, rulers like Prince Vladimir I baptized in Constantinople and converted his people, cementing religious ties to Byzantium. Varangian guards served as elite troops in the Byzantine army, and some carved runes in the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, leaving behind graffiti that can still be seen today. Beyond the famed voyages to Iceland and Greenland, the Norse ventured into the Mediterranean. In 859, a fleet sailed through the Straits of Gibraltar and raided cities along the Mediterranean coasts. They wintered in the Camargue region of France before moving on to Italy and North Africa. Muslim chroniclers recorded their attacks on the Iberian Peninsula and their eventual defeat by Andalusian forces. In the east, Norse merchants reached as far as Baghdad, as noted by Ibn Khurradadbeh. Although these journeys were exceptional, they demonstrate the Norse capacity to adapt to different climates and cultures. Encounters with Muslims, Jews, and Christians of various rites exposed them to diverse religious practices and contributed to a broad worldview. Environmental conditions influenced Norse expansion and settlement. The medieval warm period, beginning in the 8th or 9th century, brought milder temperatures and longer growing seasons to northern Europe. This allowed for population growth and surplus production, supporting maritime expeditions. Climatic shifts also impacted navigation, with ice conditions affecting routes to Greenland and North America. Later cooling phases, sometimes called the Little Ice Age, made farming in Greenland more difficult, contributing to the abandonment of Norse settlements there. Soil erosion and depletion, exacerbated by intensive grazing, reduced the viability of farms. Excavations of Greenlandic farms show signs of malnutrition and reduced livestock sizes toward the end of the settlement period. These ecological pressures, combined with reduced trade opportunities as European demand for walrus ivory declined, likely led settlers to leave or perish. The Norse presence in Greenland lasted roughly 500 years. Settlers built turf and stone houses with central hearths, similar to those in Iceland, but adapted to colder climates. They hunted seals, walrus, and caribou, and attempted to cultivate barley in sheltered plots. They traded with the indigenous Thule people, ancestors of modern Inuit, exchanging iron tools for furs and ivory. As ice conditions worsened, contact with Norway diminished, and supplies became scarce. Law codes found in Iceland reference Greenlandic legal matters, indicating ongoing connections. Eventually, the settlements vanished from the written record. Archaeologists debate whether disease, starvation, conflict, or emigration caused the disappearance. The story of Greenland highlights the fragility of frontier settlements and the importance of adaptability. Interactions with indigenous peoples of North America were brief but significant. The sagas mention encounters with Skrællingar, likely ancestors of the Beothuk or other indigenous groups. Initial contacts involved trade. The Norse offered red cloth and milk, receiving furs and food in return. Later, misunderstandings and violence arose, leading the Norse to abandon their Vinland camps. Some researchers suggest that Norse groups may have traveled further south along the Atlantic coast or into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, as indicated by the presence of butternuts at Lance or meadows trees that do not grow in Newfoundland. While evidence remains limited, these voyages represent the earliest known European presence in the Americas and foreshadow later transatlantic contacts. Language is a lasting legacy of Norse contact. Modern English contains many words of Old Norse origin: sky, knife, egg, window, law, take, they, them, and their, among others. Even pronouns changed, replacing Old English forms with Norse ones. Place names across England, Scotland, Ireland, and the Isle of Man bear Norse elements, suffixes like by for farm, thorp for village, and thwaite for clearing. Days of the week preserve Norse deities: Tuesday for Tyr, Wednesday for Odin, Woden, Thursday for Thor, and Friday for Frigg. These linguistic imprints attest to deep integration between Norse settlers and local populations. In Normandy, names like Dieppe, from Juper Deep, reflect Norse influence. In Ireland, surnames such as MacLachlan and Doyle derive from Norse ancestors. Physical, appearance, and grooming mattered to Norse people. Contrary to stereotypes of unkempt barbarians, archaeological finds include combs, ear scoops, and tweezers. Men often wore their hair long and mustaches or beards trimmed. Women braided their hair and covered it with scarves or caps. Clothing was secured with brooches, belts, and pins. Shoes made from leather or wrapped textiles protected feet. Cloaks fastened at one shoulder kept out wind and rain. Decorative elements included tablet woven trim on garments, embroidery, and metal adornments. Use of color and pattern indicated status or regional affiliation. Grooming tools found in both male and female graves suggest a shared value placed on cleanliness and appearance. Children in Norse societies learned through participation and observation. From a young age, they helped with chores, gathering firewood, caring for animals, spinning wool, or watching younger siblings. Boys practiced with wooden swords and bows, preparing for future defense or hunting. Girls learned to weave, cook, and manage household tasks. Play integrated skill development. Children skied, rode on sledges, ran races, and played games mimicking adult roles. They were also taught manners and proper speech, as social etiquette was important in building relationships and avoiding conflict. Education was informal but effective, ensuring that skills and cultural knowledge were passed down. In wealthier households, children might learn runes or hear stories from traveling skalds, fostering an appreciation for poetry and history. Health and medicine blended practical remedies with magic. Herbal knowledge was extensive. Plants like yarrow, juniper, angelica, and chamomile were used to treat wounds, infections, and digestive issues. Poultices made from moss and animal fat were applied to cuts and burns. Honey's antiseptic properties made it valuable for treating wounds and coughs. Midwives assisted with childbirth, using herbal brews to ease labor and reduce complications. Amulets inscribed with runes or carved with animal shapes were worn to ward off disease. Some sagas mention healing songs or spells, blending medicine with spirituality. Bones show evidence of healed fractures and surgical procedures, indicating knowledge of setting bones and possibly trephination. While mortality rates were high, communities invested effort in caring for the sick and injured. The sea, central to Norse life, was respected and feared. Stories tell of journeys where storms destroyed ships and crew members perished. Sailors conducted rituals before departure, sacrificing animals or offering ale to ask for safe passage. On board, crews followed routines, rowing in shifts, maintaining sails, repairing minor damage, and navigating by stars or landmarks. Food consisted of dried fish, flatbread, and fermented drinks. Sleep was taken on benches or among cargo. Storms tested seamanship. Heavy waves could capsize a ship or push it far off course. Nevertheless, experienced captains navigated treacherous waters, and tales of survival at sea became part of oral tradition. The sea connected communities and enabled expansion, but it demanded respect and caution. Norse art showcases skill and symbolism. The Oseberg, Gokstad, and Tun ship burials contain carved wooden ornaments depicting intertwining animals and dragons. Distinctive styles evolved. The Oseberg style features winding animal bodies. The Bora style emphasizes knotwork and gripping beasts. The Jelling style incorporates ribbon animals with curling tails. The Mammon style combines plant motifs with animals. And the Ernest style displays elongated animals with slim bodies and almond eyes. These styles spread through metalwork, wood carving, stone sculpture, and textiles. They adorned brooches, swords, harness fittings, church portals, and rune stones. The interplay of animals and abstract patterns may reflect mythological themes, emphasizing the interconnectedness of life and the power of nature. Metalwork further reveals artistic mastery. Filigree and granulation techniques created delicate patterns on brooches and pendants. Silver hoards unearthed across Scandinavia contained bracelets, rings, and ingots, often deliberately buried. Some hoards were hidden during times of danger. Others may have been offerings to deities. Gold foil pressed with images of human or divine figures adorned clothing or temples. Sword hilts were decorated with inlays of copper, silver, or niello, and sometimes inscribed with names or magical formulas. The Ulfberht swords produced in the Frankish Empire were traded widely and prized for their high carbon steel. Norse smiths also produced pattern-welded blades with distinctive wave patterns, combining beauty and functionality. Stone masonry appears later with the construction of churches and fortified bridges. Stave churches built from timber with intricately carved portals and roof ridges blend Norse animal motifs with Christian imagery. Examples include the Urns stave church, where serpents and vines intertwine around the doorway. As Christianity spread, churches often replaced earlier hofs but retained local artistic styles. Stone churches in Denmark and Sweden show Romanesque influence, while rune stones with crosses illustrate syncretism. Bridges were built to improve travel and trade. Some were funded by wealthy women or men as pious acts, their benefactors commemorated on stones. These constructions required collaboration, planning, and specialized skills, reflecting societal organization and wealth. The vulva occupies a fascinating place in Norse culture. She traveled from farm to farm, summoned to perform seder. Dressed in a blue cloak and adorned with beads and rings, she carried a staff with a knob or metal attachments. She sat on a high platform, covering her head with a hood, and chanted or sang to enter a trance. Women formed a circle around her, singing to call spirits. In this altered state, the vulva delivered prophecies, answered questions, and offered guidance. Her words were respected. Even chieftains sought her counsel. Cider could be used to find lost cattle, predict weather, or influence outcomes of battles. Some sagas describe Seder practitioners facing suspicion, especially men who practiced it, as the art was considered effeminate and associated with Loki. The vulva's existence shows the intersection of spirituality and social life. Underlying Norse worldview is the concept of fate, or word. Fate was not seen as an unchangeable script, but as a web woven by the Norns. Individuals had agency, but operated within patterns. Accepting one's fate with courage was a virtue, as depicted in sagas where heroes meet death without fear. This perspective may have contributed to the fearlessness ascribed to Norse warriors, who believed that bravery in battle ensured a place in Valhalla. Yet fate also recognized the power of choices and consequences. Feuds persisted when individuals clung to honor at the expense of reconciliation. Laws provided a means to manage fate, balancing retribution and compensation. The tension between free will and destiny permeates stories and informs ethical decision-making. Ragnarok, the end of the world, encapsulates the cyclical nature of Norse belief. According to myth, a series of signs will precede the final battle. Fimble winter, a long winter, the breaking of the chains of the wolf Fenrir, the release of the Midgard serpent, and the burning of the world by the fire, giant Surtur. Gods and giants will fight, many killing each other. After this destruction, a new world will emerge, green and fertile, inhabited by a few surviving gods and human beings. This narrative reflects both pessimism and hope, acknowledging that endings lead to beginnings. It may have offered comfort during hardships, reminding listeners that renewal follows catastrophe. The conversion to Christianity was gradual and pragmatic. Missionaries like Ansgar traveled to Denmark and Sweden in the 9th century, converting some chieftains but making limited progress. Viking leaders encountered Christianity through trade and raids, capturing monks who sometimes stayed on as advisors. Marriages to Christian nobility also promoted conversion. In Norway, King Olaf Tryggvason used persuasion and force to convert his subjects, destroying idols and building churches. Resistance was common. Some regions remained pagan longer than others. The process often involved syncretism, blending Christian symbols with traditional practices. Crosses carved on rune stones sometimes appear alongside depictions of Thor's hammer. Pilgrimage routes developed, connecting Scandinavia to wider Christian Europe. With time, bishops established dioceses, and monasteries became centers of learning. The adoption of Christianity also facilitated participation in European political networks. Historians caution against taking medieval chronicles at face value. Many written sources about Norse people come from their enemies or later Christian writers who emphasized violence and paganism. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes raids in terms of devastation, while Irish annals record plundering of monasteries. Such accounts reflect real suffering, but also bias. Norse sagas, though written within a Christian framework, preserve a different perspective, highlighting heroism, law, and community. Modern scholarship aims to reconcile these views, using archaeology and comparative analysis to form balanced interpretations. Recognizing bias helps us see Norse people as neither villains nor saints, but as complex human beings shaped by their time. In later centuries, Norse heritage was romanticized. During the 19th century, nationalists in Scandinavia looked to Viking history to build national identities. Writers and artists depicted brave seafarers and noble warriors, sometimes glossing over darker aspects, such as slavery. The image of horned helmets emerged in this period, popularized by costume designers for Wagner's operas. In the 20th century, Norse symbols were appropriated by extremist groups, distorting their meaning for political ends. Scholars and museums work to reclaim these symbols, emphasizing historical accuracy and cultural sensitivity. Modern enthusiasts celebrate Viking festivals, reconstruct ships, and practice crafts, focusing on historical fidelity. Living history groups demonstrate cooking, weaving, and combat techniques, engaging the public with tangible experiences. Museums and archaeological sites play a vital role in preserving and presenting Norse history. The Viking Ship Museum in Oslo houses the Oseberg, Gokstad, and Thun ships, along with burial goods. Exhibits explain ship construction, burial customs, and everyday life. The new Museum of the Viking Age, scheduled to open in the coming years, will provide expanded space and interactive displays. In Denmark, the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde allows visitors to sail reconstructed vessels. The Jorvik Viking Center in York recreates a Viking street, complete with sounds and smells. Excavations at sites like Birka, Hedeby, and Kaupang uncover trading towns with workshops, houses, and quays. Findings are carefully conserved and interpreted for both scholars and the public. Digital technologies, such as 3D scanning and virtual reality, allow wider access and experimentation. Intangible heritage is also maintained through language and religion. Modern practitioners of Asatru honor Norse deities through rituals that blend historical knowledge with contemporary spirituality. These communities emphasize values like honor, hospitality, and respect for nature. Runic studies continue, with scholars deciphering inscriptions and exploring linguistic evolution. Artists draw inspiration from Norse themes, producing music, literature, and visual art that reinterpret myths. In Iceland, the sagas are taught in schools, instilling appreciation for literary heritage. Genealogical interest connects people to Norse ancestry, while DNA studies reveal genetic links across the North Atlantic. Such activities keep the memory of the Vikings alive in diverse ways. The story of the Vikings intersects with global history. Their raids prompted coastal defenses and contributed to the decline of some kingdoms, but also stimulated trade and cultural exchange. Their settlements in the North Atlantic provided stepping stones for later exploration. Their role in the formation of Russia influenced the spread of Orthodox Christianity. Their service in Byzantium impacted political events in the Mediterranean. The movement of people, goods, and ideas across Europe, Asia, and the Atlantic during the Viking Age illustrates the interconnectedness of the medieval world. Modern globalization echoes these patterns, with diverse cultures exchanging influences, sometimes peacefully, and sometimes through conflict. As we move toward the closing of this narrative, the pace slows, mirroring the gentle decline of the Norse voyages themselves. The waters that once carried longships to distant shores now reflect only the light of the moon and stars. The farmhouses remain, their walls weathered but enduring, still sheltering families who keep traditions alive. At times, archaeologists uncover fragments of their past, an arm ring hidden beneath a house, a gaming piece lost under a floor, or a child's burial in a forgotten field. Each find is a whisper from a long-ago life, reminding us that history is composed of countless individual stories. One can imagine the woman in the Senja boat grave, lying on her side with her hands folded, her dog at her feet. She might have walked along the rocky shore, tended sheep, spun wool by the fire. Her burial goods, a sickle, beads, a weaving sword tell of everyday labor and domestic power. The scallop shells placed over another woman's mouth at Val suggest a ritual of silence or protection, a practice perhaps lost to memory. These graves speak softly across a millennium, inviting us to reflect on the mysteries and the ordinariness of life. Think also of the children buried at Østfold. Their small bones were carefully cremated and interred within stone circles. We do not know their names or the tears shed by their parents, but the care taken to bury them separately speaks of love and sorrow. Archaeology reveals not only the exploits of warriors, but also the tenderness of families and the resilience of communities. The entire story of the Vikings is not a single tale, but a tapestry woven from countless threads of sailcloth and linen, of silver wire and carved wood, of poetry and prayer. It encompasses the courage of explorers crossing unknown seas, the skill of craftsmen forging iron and weaving wool, the wisdom of storytellers preserving memories, and the faith of those who honored gods, both old and new. It spans vast distances, from the fjords of Norway to the rivers of the East and the shores of North America. It stretches across centuries, from the first recorded raid to the fading of the last pagan rituals. And yet at its heart, it returns to the simple scenes with which we began. A longhouse under a dark sky, the quiet hum of voices over the crackle of a fire, the slow rhythm of a loom, the smell of stew simmering, the soft footfall on packed earth. These are the traces left by a people whose lives were both ordinary and extraordinary. Their legacy endures in our languages, our place names, our art, and our imagination. As you drift toward sleep, let your mind wander through these old worlds. Picture the torchlight flickering on carved wooden beams, the sound of wind through pillars of a longhouse, the cool touch of stone, and the weight of time that presses gently on these stories. The Vikings were not legends, but humans who loved, worked, laughed, mourned, and dreamed. Their entire story invites us to listen quietly, to appreciate the depth of history and the beauty of lives lived long ago. The night deepens, the fire dies down, and the stories settle into silence. Good night.